I think we're going to get started. I'm Jessica Dutton with the Wrigley Institute. Thank you so much for coming. This is the next in our series, our Sustainability Professionals Speaker Series. We run this about monthly to bring real-world sustainability practitioners to campus to talk about complex cases from society and jobs outside of academia where people can really make a difference. Within the Sustainability Professionals series, we are sort of having an entrepreneurship mini-series. We brought a couple people in who are entrepreneurs in the space to sort of think about how business and sustainability can work together, and today is a great example of that. So I will let Julie Hopper introduce the speaker, but before that I wanted to say this is an opportunity for the Wrigley Institute to put in a shameless little plug for sustainability in business. We run a competition called the Wrigley Sustainability Prize. It opens in January, and it is for people that have startup business ideas in this space to give us your pitch and work with us a little bit to develop sort of what that business could look like, and the winners win prize money and mentorship. So think about that, and with that I will hand it off to Julie for today's speaker.
All right, so thanks for coming, everyone. I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Virginia Emery, she and I went to graduate school together at UC Berkeley, where we focused on entomology and environmental studies. And she was focused on studying the invasive Argentine ant, which some of my students have already seen in a lot of our insect samples, looking at how to control them through queen-based chemicals, so like things like chemical hydrocarbons and pheromones. And then she worked a lot in the tropics and a lot in South America, Central America, looking at ant mutualisms. And then went off to Washington, the state of Washington, where she was a professor as an environmental scientist, a professor of environmental science. And then worked for a non-toxic pest control company trying to control the Zika vectoring mosquito. And then she wanted to stop killing insects, I don't know why, and started to try to use insects to make money and also to help our planet, so planet and profits. And that's when she started having, trying to raise different insects in her backyard in a shed, which she has now massively scaled up and focused on the mealworm, and has a huge warehouse and huge, very successful, I think, company, and she'll tell you more about that today. So thank you.
All right. Thank you for having me. So I'm excited to tell you a little bit more about my company, as well as just sort of my journey. As Julie mentioned, I am a scientist by training, so I did a lot of field biology. These are some pictures from around the world, traveling and studying social insects, a lot of work on chemical ecology and genetics, and really enjoyed that work. But I couldn't help but think when I was in the Amazon studying ants and seeing bulldozers literally destroy my field site that what I was working on was not really going to have that much of an impact in the world. And so I started exploring and thinking about other opportunities, and entrepreneurship was definitely one of those areas that you can make a really big impact. And so I made a transition to become an entrepreneur, an insect entrepreneur. These are just a few of the news articles that have discussed the company, been featured in Forbes, the Seattle Times, GeekWire, and it's definitely, there's a growing buzz around insects as part of the food system. So yeah, the opportunity for the business really centers around just thinking about insects in a different way. We think about them as pests and these sort of things to get rid of, when really there's a lot of opportunity with insects. Have you guys covered ecosystem services and this concept where there's a value to what ecosystems do for us, and if we had to replace that with something of human creation, you can actually put a dollar value on what that service is like. And so the service value of insects is actually incredibly huge. There's a lot of undeveloped opportunities, so these are developed markets and opportunities. We think about honeybees, we think about silk, but in animal feed in particular, which is where I'm focused, there's a lot of opportunity to develop insects for economic benefit. And just as the food system works best when it replicates nature. This is where we're trying to match the roles that insects play in nature to what we do with them in our business. So if you think about what bugs do in nature, nature's biorecyclers, so they're involved with a lot of waste management, and they are the base of most food chains. And there is a sort of overlap here in nature, which is quite large, of course, but from a regulatory standpoint here in the US, we have to be sort of careful about how we think about this. And part of our mission is to make the overlap of these two areas grow as much as we can so that we're using food waste instead of competing with food sources for other animals. So when you start a business, you really have to think about what is that opportunity? What's the market opportunity? Who's going to pay for this? And why? And the reason why I think there's so many opportunities in this sector is that there are huge challenges in food production. So the sort of idea that there'll be 10 billion people on the planet within a few decades, I'm sure everyone's heard this, and the incredible challenges that we're going to face to feed all of these people. So we're seeing a huge increase in the demand for meat. That's definitely one of the biggest drivers for changing how we think about feeding those animals. Protein and fat are some of the most expensive ingredients of animal diets, and also some of the most energy intensive. And both animal and plant proteins, just protein in general, we're seeing increasing demand for protein as people are having more nutritious diets. Animal feed is a $400 billion global market, and it follows all the same trends that we're seeing in food production, with consumers wanting to have organic food, fresh food, food that's local, and also affordable. And so there's a lot that people who eat are asking from our food system, and there's some real needs for innovation. Animal feed is something that most people don't think about. So think a little bit about the food you've eaten. If you had meat today or yesterday or anytime this week, if you had chicken or pork or beef, fish, if you had eggs or dairy, raise your hand. So on this planet, there's about 7 billion people that eat meat, and we don't think a lot about what it is that our meat is eating, but we really should think a lot more about this. Animal feed is food, and so there's a huge amount of high quality production that needs to happen here. We can't just give animals garbage in our food production. And that demand is very much across the world. But most of the ingredients that we use are harvested just in a few places. So fish meal, one of the ingredients we replace, most of that is harvested out of the coast of Chile. And so you have this one spot where you harvest once a year, and then that nutrition has to be able to service and feed global demand. So there's some real challenges there and a lot of spoilage that happens. A third of all the crops on the planet go to feed animals. So we're already using most of our the arable land that's available to produce feed. So we need to start thinking outside of the field. And feed's the single largest cost of producing meat. And so these are some of the big opportunities that we see for changing the food system. To give a little more complexity and detail to this, these feed markets, as I mentioned, are global. There's thousands of tons of unmet demand. So the scale of production that we're talking about is huge. Think about thousands of tons of bugs. That's what we're trying to produce. There's a huge amount of spoilage, but also contamination. So mycotoxins, these are a type of residue toxins left behind by fungus and mold, and up to 90% of feed ingredients are contaminated. Right now in the US, the solution to pollution is dilution. So they just sort of spread that out. If you have a really highly contaminated crop, they just dilute that in the food system. And places like Africa, they don't have the same kind of infrastructure, and so these contaminated lots just get used directly. And it's thought that up to 90% of the African continent deals with chronic health problems because of mycotoxins. The most toxic compound in the world is aflatoxin on a gram-by-gram basis. And this can cause chronic and acute health problems and a lot of death in both animals and humans. So real issues here that we're addressing with what we do. The impact of feed in meat production is actually quite large. So I'm sure you've heard a lot about just how much more intensive meat production is. The CO2 from feed production includes, so the methane from digestion is a big piece of the impact there, which is directly related to what that food looks like. But then also just directly the fertilizers, the other inputs to produce the land use change to produce the feed actually has a big impact on the footprint of meat. And there's a lot of unpredictability. So fish meal, we harvest a lot of small fish out of the ocean to feed the fish in aquaculture. And a lot of those wild fish populations, for example, fluctuate with El Nino. And so there's a lot of unpredictability in a lot of these supply chains. And these are all problems that my company, BetaHatch, is working to solve. Just to sort of drive home the sort of importance of the feed system, because most people don't think about it at all. I spend pretty much every day thinking about this, but the average eater doesn't think about what it is their meat eats. But this just sort of shows you the distribution of crop production in the world, and a significant amount of the arable lands that we've developed for agriculture is going towards feed and fuel production. So it's not so much that we can't feed the planet, it's that the way our current food systems are structured needs to be rethought so that we can be more efficient in how we're feeding the planet. The other area where there's these big opportunities is of course around waste. So this is just showing, across different parts of the world what the different type of waste streams look like. It's pretty small font, but you can see it's broken down by, is it an agricultural, post-harvest, processing, distribution, or consumption where this waste is happening. Obviously consumption, that sort of light bar, is a big piece of this, but huge amount of waste before it even gets to the consumer. And those are the opportunities that we've been targeting. So we have a solution to all these problems I just described. We're farming insects. In particular, we grow the mealworms. This is a type of beetle, also known as Tenebrio molitor. This is a picture of the larva. And mealworms are our super bug. We grow them because you can farm them year-round. So unlike that very seasonal production, we can produce them year-round, matching the year-round demand. We can do this virtually anywhere. So we've I did this out of a climate-controlled shed in my backyard. And then I worked out of a converted office space. Now we're in a warehouse, and ultimately we see a lot of opportunity in converting structures like poultry houses into bug production facilities. The mealworm's dry adapted, so we can grow it with very little water, less than 1% of the water that it would take for the same volume as soy. So a very water efficient crop. And as nature's biorecyclers, they can break down all kinds of things, including those mycotoxins that I mentioned, and plastic. So the only known way to biodegrade styrofoam is actually in the gut of a mealworm. So they're just these little digestive powerhouses. And what we basically have is a bioreactor in the form of a bug. So there's all kinds of things that we can feed them. And finally, they're a natural part of the diet of most birds and fish and a lot of other animals. So it's not just the calories, but other values such as immune boosting effects. We actually need fewer antibiotics when animals are fed insects. So a lot of value here. My company makes money by selling two products. So we sell the insects as animal feed, and so this is mostly targeting aquaculture and poultry. And then they also produce frass. Does anyone know what frass is? What's frass? Huh?
It's the carcasses of the animals or the insects that get put into fertilizer.
Close. It's the poop of the insects. So frass is insect poop. And so we have a saying at BetaHatch that frass happens. It's on our t-shirts. So frass is a complete organic fertilizer. So it ends up being virtually zero waste process. And so we can actually sell both the insects and the insect manure as valuable products. So you might wonder, okay, if bugs are so great, why aren't they already part of the food system? Well, it's actually really hard to grow bugs. If you've grown fruit flies on your kitchen counter, you might disagree, but on the scales that we're talking about, this is a whole new type of challenge. So there's no established stock, there's no supply chain for insects, so there's a lot of challenges there. We're doing a lot of development of the supply chain for our production. It's really expensive to produce insects, in large part because it's labor intensive right now. So we need to apply a lot of automation. feed is food, and so we have to produce in a food grade way. So there are some challenges there with how to be sourcing ingredients and producing, and we just never produced at these scales before, so there's a lot of challenges in scaling up. And this is where we've been developing a lot of technology. So we have the world's first breeding program for insects. We're growing faster growing, bigger insects that lay more eggs and are more productive. We use a lot of off-the-shelf equipment, but where we can't find something, we invent. So it's this cool intersection of entomology and engineering. We have some patents on equipment that are specific to what we do. A lot of opportunity there. We have a huge diet development program looking to source feedstocks and trying to find the sort of lowest value feedstocks that we can still use from a regulatory standpoint. And just a whole suite of processes that allow us to produce more efficiently. Right now, we're on track to produce at 5,000 times the acre yield of soy. So an acre of soy in an acre of bug farm, you're going to get 5,000 times more protein in a year out of the bug farm. So huge, huge efficiency here on a square foot basis. Just going to dig a little bit into some of the technology. So on the breeding side, we've got a couple of big grants through the NSF and DARPA that are allowing us to develop genomic tools for this insect. We're actually doing some RNAi, so RNA interference to knock down certain genes, some CRISPR, which are some modifications to those genes, turning on and turning off things that are of interest to us in, say, metabolism or growth. Our goal is not to put a GMO bug on the market. It's more to learn about the genome of these guys so we can incorporate that into a traditional breeding program. If you look at where chicken was, 50 years ago, it took more than 6 months to grow a chicken, and now it takes 6 weeks. That has all been through traditional breeding. 99% of the gains that we have made in agriculture have all come from traditional breeding. So that's the approach that we're taking with our bugs, but we're using modern tools to inform that. And it's allowing us to produce more efficiently and more cheaply. We have insect-centered design. So this is the life cycle of the insect. They start as an adult as a beetle. They lay eggs. Those eggs hatch into larvae. Those larvae will turn into pupa, and the cycle continues. And so at every step of the process, we have equipment, we have special approaches for how we're producing, and this is allowing us to be efficient with how we produce. A lot of science and technology involved in our everyday operations. As I mentioned, we have a diet development program. This is a picture of different types of bug poop. So just as what you eat will change what comes out, so it happens with the bugs. So we've looked at over 100 different ingredients, everything from dried distillers grain, which is a byproduct of biofuel production, to spent brewer's grain. So if you imagine you've got beer, leftover grains, the bugs can eat that. The frass can go back and fertilize the barley and the hops to make the beer. We start closing the loop on a lot of these systems. And then we have a big project right now with mycotoxins. So trying to use the insect to take these contaminated feedstocks and break them down. We've been collaborating with the not the Gates Foundation, but Global Good, which is an arm of the Gates work in Africa, to try to think about how we could deploy insect farms as a supply chain changer in some of those areas. So right now, if a farmer gets a contaminated lot, they need to make that money, so they have to sell it somewhere. So they go to a distributor and they'll get a lower price, but it still gets into the food system, this contaminated lot. So having an alternative market for them to sell that feedstock to a bug farmer, where we could actually take the product, break it down, and break down the toxins completely. It recovers those nutrients still into the food system, but is eliminating the toxicity. So that's something that our bugs can do. We actually have yet to find a mycotoxin or a mycotoxin level that they can't deal with. So it's pretty incredible digestion that we're dealing with there. And then just the approach to how we grow. So we farm them in trays. That's the basic unit of production. It's actually the largest part of our capital expenses. So the cost of our facility, the single largest cost of our facility is actually the trays, because we have to buy hundreds of thousands of these things. Those trays will combine into a pallet, which is our growing unit. And so we can move with forklifts, move these growing units around as we need to for processing. Most of the time they live in a climate controlled grow room, but we do have to bring them out to a processing suite to refeed them, to separate them at harvest. And so there's a lot of operational efficiencies here. And ultimately, we're building what we call a ranch. They're an animal, so we're not a farm, we're a ranch. And we have multiple grow rooms within the ranch where we're basically isolating different batches so that if there is a pest, we have pest management issues just like any other crop, we can contain it more easily. We actually have an integrated pest management program, and you can imagine how challenging it is when you're trying to grow bugs and bugs come into your facility. You can't use chemicals, you can't use traditional techniques. And so biocontrol, a lot of prevention, of course, and a lot of risk reduction, but we're looking to sort of more natural approaches to how we think about pest control. So, how do we make money? What's the business model? We have a unique approach to how we grow, and this is actually how most livestock is grown in the country. The breeding part of the life cycle is separated from the growing part of the life cycle. And so we produce the eggs, we do the breeding at what we call the hatchery, and we grow the product at what we call the ranch. And this allows us to have distributed production and work with contract farmers on the ranching piece of the equation. This is a business model innovation that is quite different from some of the other insect producers and is allowing us to more rapidly scale what we do. There's sort of 3 phases to how we're growing. We're kind of coming up to the end of the first phase as an innovator. We're about to enter the second phase as a breeder and producer. But ultimately, we're establishing the company as a knowledge company, so offering a turnkey solution to produce insects and a huge amount of data. We're talking about big data when it comes to just understanding how all of these pieces interact so that we can really optimize and learn from that and further enhance the productivity of our systems. So first stage, the focus is on automation. So this is just showing the cost of production for eggs. And labor, you can see, is the biggest part of our cost right now. So this is where we're applying a lot of automation, trying to develop both new tools and apply off-the-shelf tools. So this is one of the first things that we're working on. We're kind of entering the second stage as we're working to scale our volume. So this is just a schematic of the facility where we are going to be actually building in the next few months. I have a design meeting tomorrow. So this is a 33,000 square foot warehouse, 22 feet tall, huge, huge, huge space that we're filling with insects in a climate controlled environment. And of course, all of the processing that goes into it. It's about a $6 million project. And so there's quite a lot of design work and technology going into this, this new flagship facility. And ultimately, this hub and spoke approach is that we have these ranches that can be around the country, and from this facility that we're building this year and next year, we can send eggs to these ranchers around the country. So eggs would get airmailed to our ranchers. They can sell frass locally, so there's less transportation distance of that fertilizer product, and then we aggregate their feed volumes to be able to sell to bigger customers. They work with us on quality control. We can ship out our R&D and new technology developments to them, and the idea is that we can deploy this model worldwide. So you can imagine having a regional hatchery and producing insects around the world. See. So one of the challenges with a new business like this, has anyone heard about some of the cellular meat technology, like growing meat in a petri dish? Does anyone have a guess of how expensive it is to do that on a per pound basis? It is. They started at close to $200,000 a pound. They have been working down. I think they're now, last year they were close to $11,000 a pound. I think they're in the high, like $900 a pound now. But still, it's very expensive to make some of these alternative proteins and to make something new. That's not to say that they're not going to eventually get to be competitive with beef or some of these other existing products, but it's really important to the long-term success of some of these new technologies. So we don't have quite the same steepness of a challenge. We're trying to hit about a $2,000 a ton price point, which is the current cost of fish meal. We're currently producing at about 6,000 a ton, and at the new facility we'll actually be at around 3,000 a ton. So we're getting pretty close. But this is always one of the challenges with a new technology business, is really finding ways to bring down the cost of production. There's a lot of economies of scale that go with this, but for us there's also a lot of technology. So as we're applying automation, as we're breeding our insects, we're bringing down those costs. And this is really important to the success of these tools that are being developed kind of for the future, for food sustainability. It has to make economic sense for it to be successful. A little bit about the business, just so you guys kind of know what we've accomplished over the last few years. So to date, over $4.5 million that we've secured to develop our technology. We have a really cool project right now with Washington State. So that facility I showed you a bit of a diagram of, there's a data center that mines Bitcoin right next door. So we're going to be taking the waste heat from that data center to heat our bugs. So it's an energy efficiency project. A lot of engineering involved in making this happen. But you can imagine that all these server farms around the country that are basically, they just pump out heat and melt snow in the winter and heat things up in the summer. I don't know if you guys have talked about heat pollution, but this is a challenge. We are a user, we want to capture that heat. So there's some interesting co-location that we could see, putting our bug farms next to data centers to use that heat. We have a customer right now, chubby mealworms, that we sell whole dried insects. And it's interesting, that customer's main user are backyard bird farmers. So these are people who have chickens in their backyard to grow their own eggs. And ironically, because they're not regulated in the same way as large commercial production is, those producers aren't really protected in the same ways. And 100% of the mealworms that are on the market today come from China. And I've been to China and I've seen some of these operations, and they're literally feeding them garbage in some cases. So there's been heavy metal issues, salmonella, other contaminants. And these small farmers who are trying to make their own food aren't protected in the same ways as a large commercial farmer is. So we're trying to come in with a food grade, American grown product to help people grow their own food. The realm of sort of venture capital is something that I'm pretty deep into right now, because we're raising a Series A, so I'm raising $8 million from investors as we speak. I had a lunch meeting with an investor over in Beverly Hills, actually. And last year we raised a Series Seed, so the sort of initial investment into the business, and Wilbur Ellis, which is a multinational, multi-billion-dollar distributor of feed ingredients, was one of the investors. So that's a whole, I'm happy to answer questions about that whole process, but that's been an interesting learning process for me. So with our seed money, we built our first pre-commercial facility. So this is in SeaTac. And that's allowed us to design our flagship facility, which is going to be over in Wenatchee. So SeaTac up in Seattle. I'll show you a bit of a picture here. This is what that facility, just a snapshot of what that facility looks like. So it's designed to do about a ton a month of capacity. Sounds like a lot of bugs. In the scheme of the demand, thousands of tons of demand, it's very small. But we are the largest producer of mealworms in North America for this market. So it gives you a sense of kind of where we are as an industry. Still very very early, very supply limited. And a lot of the goal was to establish our processing capacity. So we're looking into the processing room here because we wanted to understand what the supply chain would look like. So this is just a diagram of the layout of the facility. We built 3 grow rooms where we grow different life stages and different parts of the life cycle. And 2 processing rooms where we process the product and feed the insects, do all that. And then every block here is a piece of that supply chain that we're thinking about as we're developing our systems and our technology. This is just sort of showing the progress over the last few years. So incredible scaling up of our volumes of production, a lot of reductions in our costs, huge development of technology. And as I said, we're kind of going to this next level. We'll be doing about a 60 to 100x scale up in terms of volume, and we'll be cutting our costs more than in half at the next facility. So, when I started out, I just had a little climate-controlled shed in my backyard. I knew this was definitely possible. It was sort of in my mind, but it's pretty incredible looking back now that I'm raising $8 million. I manage $4.5 million of federal funding. I've got a staff of 13, and we're building a 33,000 square foot bug factory. So it's pretty cool, this sort of path of entrepreneurship, where it's taken me. As I said, I've got a team of 13. There are 6 PhDs on the team, so there's quite a few jobs for outside of academia that we've been creating. There's experts in engineering and in entomology, and it's actually, we look for something a little different as well when we try to find people to bring into the team. Being at a startup is very different than being at a large company. Everyone has to do a little bit of everything, so everyone here has to clean toilets, has to take out trash. Every so often, you get sort of pulled into something that's totally out of your field, like you're regularly a scientist, but you have to, talk to a customer, or, it's sort of a jack of all trades that you have to do when you're at a startup. You have to do what needs to be done to make things go. And so that's definitely something that we look for a lot, is sort of the attitude and culture of everyone on our team. So as I said, the sort of next phase here, we're building this flagship facility over in Kashmir, and I'll show you, one of the big things that we're trying to do there is put a lot more automation into what we do. Agriculture is one of these sort of frontiers where we have sort of a less than usual application of automation. So this just shows you in sort of the manufacturing sector how much more they can be automating in comparison to, say, if you look at, in agriculture, there's huge opportunities for automation. So a lot of the work that we do in agriculture could be automated. We just need to start applying some of those tools. So they're starting to develop cool robots for fruit picking and what have you. There's other trends with farming moving indoors. So this is something that across the world we're seeing because of climate change in part. The unpredictability of the climate is making us want to be producing in more predictable environments. Also the fact that people used to live closer to farms, and with urbanization, there's become huge transportation challenges with food production. So by moving indoors, we can move food production closer to consumers. Obviously, when you come indoors, you also want to use the space efficiently, and so there's a lot of vertical farming that is happening. Here's a picture of Aero farms. This is over in New Jersey. They actually grow in a system called aeroponics. So they use a mist instead of water. So instead of hydroponics, they're using sort of aerosolized mist for how they're producing. And these vertical farms, when it comes to plants, there's a lot of energy requirements because of lighting, and this is one of the great things about what we do. Our insect is called the yellow mealworm, also called the darkling beetle, and we can grow them without needing light. And so we get much higher densities and far less energy use for what we do. And of course, this sort of urban trend is something that's happening as well. So our current customers, as I mentioned, are growing eggs and chickens in an urban setting, and we're starting to see a lot of interest in more urban systems. Rooftop production. Freight Farms is a company that produces out of cargo containers, and so there's a lot of developments happening there. So I guess we're at a point, I had sort of 2 alternate things. I could talk a little bit more about some supply chain stuff, or I could talk a little bit more about genetics. Genetics? So this will give you kind of a snapshot into the science. So that was the business talk. Now I'll show you a bit of the science that we're working on. So this is pulled from a part of a presentation I gave in January at the Animal Genome Conference. These are a few of our collaborators at the USDA and in Indiana who we work with on this project. So, insect breeding, this big part of what we do, there's some unanswered questions. So first off, are there genetic differences between different strains of mealworms? And so we cultivated a variety of strains, looked at the different trait values for those different strains of insects, and looked at trade-offs. are the traits that we're seeing heritable? So is there a link between the genetics and the traits? So is there a foundation there for breeding? A lot of questions around what the genetic diversity is. We're doing a lot of phenotype mapping now, and we've sequenced the genome. And finally, does the microbiome play a role? So do different strains have different microbiomes, gut biome in particular, and then does diet affect that? And so we've done a lot of feeding experiments, and we've done sequencing of the microbiome. So looking at different mealworm strains, so this set of data, we looked at 13 different strains from around North America. So the mealworm's grown for, does anyone have geckos or turtles? You might have seen mealworms before. They're used for exotic animal feed, so there's a lot of existing farms. So we were able to pull, we surveyed over 75 producers. Turns out there's only 13 unique suppliers. A lot of them are sort of shadow distributors of one another, and raised them up and evaluated different traits. So one of the big outcomes, this is a lot of data. As I said, big data is one of the products of our company, is that we see a lot of differences in adult size and performance. So strain I and strain H. Strain I is actually derived from strain H, but has been selected for larger size. And so there's a huge size variation. We see that, so this is average adult weight here, but then we also see oviposition. So how many eggs is each female laying per day? We see a lot of differences across the strains. And so, as far as egg production per adults, we've been able to identify a few top performers. And this is something that, from a commercial standpoint, is super valuable for us to make sure we're using the right genetic stock. Feeding performance also varies across strains. So this is a metric we use. There's about 5 different metrics we use. This one's called live weight gain per food consumed. So a way of measuring how much weight the mealworm puts on depending on how much they're eating. So obviously a higher number is better. You can see we have some poor performers. And then when you look at the individual larval weight at harvest, we also see a lot of variation. So on those traits, we see a lot of differences. So then, of course, there's this question, is there a genetic basis for these traits? So we looked at trait values across generations, so trying to do parent-offspring mapping. So we look at what the parents look like, look at what their offspring look like, trying to figure out, is there some heritability here? We initially used an AFLP analysis, so this is kind of a bit of an older technique. It's amplified fragment length polymorphism, but we were able to sort of look at a lot of different loci in the genome to get a picture of what the diversity looked like. But then we also sequenced the genome, which is a far more detailed and accurate way to look at diversity. So as far as the trait variation, we do see some correlations across traits. So adult body weight, you can see that there's a correlation there. So this is something that we assume has got a strong genetic foundation. Oviposition rate, so how many eggs per female per day. Again, some good indications there that this is a heritable trait. Larval traits are also correlated, some of them a little less so, but we do see feeding performance. Here's another metric measured in a slightly different way. But generally, we're seeing that there's some suggestions some of these traits might be heritable. These are just a few measures of molecular variance, so how much diversity is there. And so we see that they're actually, the population in North America is fairly inbred, but we do see in these 3 strains, for example, we think are probably actually the same thing. But we do see some variations here, suggesting that there's been a little bit of differentiation. And this is just a sort of indication of how different these strains are. So you can imagine that if we had a lot of differentiation, you would see assignments to the correct strain 100% of the time across the board. and we don't see that. So again, there's some variation, but as a domesticated species, a lot less than we would see in, say, a wild population. And then some details about the genome that probably is just Latin to most of you, but effectively they've got a fairly large genome. What's really interesting is that they actually have this weird repeat that makes up a huge percentage of the genome. So it's very fragmented, and we've been working on a genome assembly that we're publishing soon. But up to 46% of the genome, 47% is the highest number, is this repeat. So there's a lot of questions here if this is related potentially to something phenotypic. So we're exploring this right now. And as I said, doing some cool stuff with RNAi and CRISPR to further dig into what the genome looks like. So the microbiome is the last piece of what I'll sort of share on the science side here. So we wanted to know, okay, there's some heritability here, but they're also inheriting some of those microbes. So maybe it's not necessarily the insects themselves that are related to, say, feeding conversion, but rather the microbiome. So we looked at the microbiome, and we looked at 2 diets as well, bran and canola. Have you guys covered diversity? I think, Julie, you said you guys did that. So we looked at a couple diversity indices. So we found that there's actually no difference in diversity between strains or diets. So, there's a community that's needed. We don't see like one particular taxa taking off when we have change in diet. But there's hundreds of different OTUs, taxonomic units, in the mealworm gut. So a lot to sort of mine here, but across different groups of microbes, we see a lot of variation here. So looking at some principal component analysis here, we do see that there actually is more similarity within strain than between strain. So even though we're not seeing a strong difference in diversity, the composition of those communities seems to be a little bit different depending on the strain. These aren't great separations, so there's, again, a lot of data to mine here. We're talking about you need like terabytes of data storage for a lot of this stuff. But we do see a couple of strains that do seem to have some unique differences. And when it comes to the diet, so here we have canola meal and wheat bran. In a few cases, we did see some differences there. So this makes sense if you look at the human data on the gut microbiome, and the microbiome is sort of the next frontier of understanding all biological systems, including soil. But with human guts, people in different parts of the world have different gut microbiomes depending on what they eat. So, and then, really the takeaway message is that mealworm microbiomes are complex. Lactobacillus, one of the key microbes that's involved in yogurt production, for example, seems to be a key player. It's a fermentation based microbe, and so they've evolved on wheat-based diets, so it kind of makes sense that there'd be some fermentation going on. And so there's a lot of dynamics here, a lot of things going on to how we are understanding and developing these systems. So I guess I just want to end by sort of highlighting the importance of what we're working on. And I think that we don't often stop to think about food. We kind of take it for granted. But if you think about it, every day, 3 times a day, everyone here needs a farmer. So if you're trying to find a career that is fulfilling and is going to have durability, food production is certainly up there, because are we going to still need to have your Snapchat app in 20 years? I don't know. Are we going to need food? Absolutely. So farming is definitely one of these fun careers, and it's not just digging in the dirt. There's a lot of fun science and business involved in making it successful. All right, happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much for coming It's really interesting talk. Do you have more customers right now than the chubby? Mm-hmm. Do you have any other customers as well?
Well, we do to some extent, in the sense that we have a pipeline of customers. We're so supply limited right now, we can't even service the full volume of what this customer wants. So you do want to make sure your business is diversified, you're not relying on just one customer. But I had a call this morning with a company called Skredding. They do 30% of aquaculture production in the world. So there's customers like that we're talking to. Interestingly, they said, they have tens of thousands of tons of demand from their customers for these kinds of alternative protein ingredients. And even the largest insect producers can supply in their yearly production less than 1 month's worth of demand that they have. So there's a huge supply limitation, so a lot of demand and not a lot of supply, which is a great business opportunity. Yeah. Yeah?
How long did it take you, because you said you started this in your backyard, right?
Yeah.
How long did it take you to build up enough of a stock to actually be able to sell it?
Well, yeah, so I guess to give a little history, so I started in 2015, in the summer of 2015, built our shed, started growing insects, had a lot of fun failures. So for example, the first batch of insects that I ordered, it was about 500,000 mealworms. The first mealworm batch that I ordered, about 500,000 live insects that had to get airmailed to me, go to the airport, pick them up, and open the first box. They sent me 500,000 mealworms and about 500 cockroaches. So enough cockroaches that, of course, they would cause a problem. So I spent the first few days of my bug growing career killing cockroaches with my bare hands because that was the only way to catch them. So you get fun things like that, sort of stories throughout the progress of what you do. So it started out very sort of humble and sort of just experimenting. The first step was I got a loan from some friends and family. And there was a program in Washington State that matched that loan, built out the office space. So just using regular climate control from office space, built walls with plastic from Home Depot. The total cost was maybe $30,000 initially to get that set up. And then started just sort of building the story of the business. I did an accelerator program where I worked with an organization in Washington that sort of trained me on how to do business and think about the business, how to structure the story of the business to make it appealing for investors. And then by summer 2016, I got my first investment. So it took me about a year to go from sort of starting out to getting the first real investment, and then to continue building out the team and scaling our production. It's sort of just been slow incremental growth and a lot of learning on the job. But it takes patience and perseverance. There's a lot of times that I wanted to quit. We had in the office farm, our pilot farm, an infestation of moths that came in one year. This was in, I guess, late 2016. These moths came into the facility and established, and so we quickly had a moth farm instead of a mealworm farm. And the only way to get rid of them was, because we just didn't have the right containment strategy, was to throw them out. So we had to throw out the whole farm, literally bring stuff to the dump. I had to lay off 2 of my 4 employees, so half my team. And then we got in a car accident on the way to the dump, and one of my employees got an injury. And so there's all these things that will happen when you're doing a business, but you can't let those setbacks set you back. So it's really just about persevering and taking time. And especially for a business like this, that there's so much technology, that sort of, pathway from starting to being successful. It takes a lot of know-how and science and technology development. Yeah?
Are there any other insects in the future that you would want us to start farming or possibilities?
Yeah, I've got a slide sort of comparing some of the 3 most common bugs. Let's see. Here. So we grow the mealworm. These are some of the reasons that we like them. So they have pretty simple mating. The adults can live for a very long time. The black soldier fly is the other major one that's being developed for feed, and that's probably the one you've heard most about. Julie and I went to Catalina Island on Friday, and we saw a black soldier fly operation that they have there to deal with their food waste. And so this is a fly, so it's got a different kind of mating and life cycle. People like it because it feeds on, food waste, but from an operating standpoint, there's challenges there because that food waste attracts a lot of other insects, and so there's higher pest management risks. The substrate that they live in has to be kept wet, so some climate challenges there, but they grow faster, so that's the biggest trade-off with them. You might have heard about crickets. Is anyone here eating crickets? People tried them? Oh, you gotta bring in some samples for everyone to try in the class. That's the kind of group of insects being developed mostly for human food. And I can speak at length on that because we've looked at the human food opportunity as well. And people like the cricket because they're lean, so they have a lower fat content. But there are some challenges with growing them because they take a lot of 3D space. And things like the chirping, the mating can be a lot more complicated.
They did cricket behavior.
So you guys know all about that. Was anyone inspired to be a cricket farmer after that?
No.
Yeah. I personally, I don't like crickets. Just as I don't like orthopterans, the jumping grasshoppers and crickets at all. They're just like my least favorite type of insect. But some people quite like them. So these are kind of the three main ones that are being developed right now in the food and feed space. But I do know of producers growing other types of fruit flies, some Mediterranean fruit fly, which is interesting because it's an agricultural pest, but they're trying to grow it for protein production. Our company is growing grasshoppers. There's a lot of food companies growing other species or harvesting other species rather than farming them. So there's a lot of development. Over 2,000 species of insect have been identified as edible. So there's a lot of opportunity. Yeah?
What first inspired you to do this?
It's like to start a business?
Yeah, and also how did you notice this, role in the market?
Yeah, so there's a report published in 2013 by the UN called, I think it was Insects to Feed the World. But basically the UN published a 100+ page report on this opportunity of insects in food and in feed, and that sort of spurred a lot of activity in the space. So that's kind of how I got started. That was on my radar. I got contacted actually by a couple other entrepreneurs who wanted to consult with an entomologist, and part of what really inspired me individually to go and to start my own company instead of joining another company was that there was very little science that I saw happening with these companies I was working with. So just seeing this gap in a need for technical knowledge of entomology, of insect production, to help drive and solve some of these challenges, because all the problems that they were encountering were problems that I knew I could solve. So I thought, well, why give this knowledge to someone else when I could be building value from that in my own way. So that was sort of the initial sort of start. And I think that often you get a flavor of some of that when you're exploring career options, and that was part of what happened for me. Is I was trying to think about what I wanted to do after grad school and got into a few of these consulting jobs, working for some other small businesses, teaching. It all sort of just came together that I decided that I wanted to try it. Yeah. And actually, I will say as well, this competition that is being hosted, that is something, when I was at Berkeley, was not on my radar as far as having a university program to support my entrepreneurship. But increasingly, universities are getting much better at that, helping support student entrepreneurs. And that's a great way to sort of try it out, develop a business plan, see if your idea makes sense, if people latch onto it as something attractive and interesting. It's a great way to sort of get your toes wet. And then there's often a lot of funding and other support that universities offer. So my husband's also an entrepreneur. He works in marine renewable energy. So I don't know, have you guys talked about renewable energies? Okay. But as far as renewable energy, so tidal energy, wave energy, and his business, he started through a business plan competition. So those are some great ways to get started if you're thinking about it.
you have any successful biocontrol programs for pests under your bench?
Well, we're developing a lot of technology around this. So that there's some natural enemies that we've thought about adding to help control certain pests. But right now, knock on wood, we have very few pest problems. A lot of it's prevention. So controlling the conditions and the climate. We do everything that comes into the facility gets treated so that if that's basically our biggest risk, is the feed that we bring in could have something in it. We've made paradise for insects, so everyone wants to live there, so we have to be really careful. There's a lot of physical containment, so we have a lot of netting and sort of double door security on all of our grow rooms, and then a lot of biosecurity from humans bringing stuff in and out as well. So everyone wears lab coats and hairnets, and depending on what's going on, they'll wear booties. Just so, humans tend to be one of the biggest vectors of some of these issues. But we know this is going to be an area that we continue to see challenges. I don't know if you guys have heard of the African swine virus that has recently ripped through swine around the world. But in China, they actually culled more pigs than we grow in a year in the entire country of the United States. So they killed as many pigs as we produce in a whole year because of this virus. And that's the kinds of risks that spread when you have a different type of production system. So one of the reasons that it was such a big problem there is that they don't have the same biosecurity and containment and tracking of where animals are moving as we do here in the US. And so that virus spread like crazy. And that's one of the reasons that as we're thinking about our system, we're designing multiple facilities, so instead of having one big factory, we have 10. So if something comes into one, it doesn't shut down the whole production. We can shut that down, decontaminate it, but we still have 9 other producing facilities. So these are the kinds of risks that we've thought about as we design what we do. Lots of opportunities though. I think in future we'll see business in pest management for insect farms, but it's early, so yeah.
Hi, that was really inspirational, thank you. I wanted to ask you, I guess kind of 2 questions that are sort of related. My first question is, so from what I gathered is that you want to sell the knowledge, you don't want to sell the bugs themselves, or do you want to sell like a beginner pack of them or something?
So it's a kind of multi-pronged business model. We sell, most of our revenue, how we make money is selling the product.
Okay.
So, but from an operating standpoint, we also, I guess, sell a business, almost like a franchise, to a farmer. So we work with a farmer, say someone who's growing poultry, and they're working for, growing poultry for Tyson or someone like this. Tyson right now will ship little chicks to them, they grow them up, they send the chips to processing, and they get paid for the big birds that they produce. They don't have to worry about how the product is sold or marketed. They just have to operate and they get paid. So we would work with that farmer and say, hey, do you want to make more money doing work that's a little less smelly and nicer than growing chickens? Mm-hmm. We would retrofit their facility to produce bugs, and then they would, instead of buying chicks, they would buy eggs from us, feed from us, grow that product up, and then we buy the product from them and sell it through our channels. So it allows us to scale more quickly because we don't have to finance and operate all those facilities ourselves. So kind of looking to existing, there's no point in reinventing the wheel. So we're looking at what the existing business models are that have been successful and trying to take inspiration from that. Yeah, I will say on the sort of subject of, this factory farming, these insects are basically, designed for that. They like to be in crowded conditions. They often actually will perform and digest better when they're in an environment with more of them. They don't have the same sort of needs to be free range or have mobility, right? So it's actually almost like a perfect production system for indoor production, much more so than a lot of the other animals that we're producing. Yeah.
Would you say that targets like your organic farmers more so? Just trying to imagine these Monsanto type farms taking on this?
Yeah, I mean, all of the entire supply chain sees the problems that we're going to be facing with volume of production, sustainability of production. I think that cost is one of the biggest challenges for them. So any innovations that will bring down the cost of production, there's a huge interest there. Initially, I think our customers are in the organic space for sure. They value the sustainability of what we're doing, these higher per square foot values we can get, the lower greenhouse gas footprint, the reuse of organics, the less water that's being used. All these are sort of big bonuses to a lot of our current customers. But ultimately, business is about money. So we need to be able to save our customer money in some way or enhance the money that they can get for a product. And so that's all part of how we think about what we do. And I think there's, you have to kind of remember that, to do good in the world with business, you have to do good business. So that's definitely something that underlines how we think about everything that we do, is that, we try to make sure we're keeping all of our core principles around sustainability in mind, but we have to do good business for it to be successful. Yeah. Yep.
How does mealworm poop compare to other waste used as fertilizer?
It's a good question. So different manures have different nutritional profiles. What you put in changes what you get out. Right now, the NPK, so nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium, those are kind of the three main nutrients you think about in terms of fertilizer. For our products, about a 5-4-3 with the feedstocks we're using. It ranges, we've had 2-2-2, we've had as high as like 7-5-4. It just really depends on what we feed them. Compared to, say, it's comparable to a poultry manure, but it's immediately usable. So it looks like sand, and it's dry, so we don't have to process it any further. If you want to use a poultry manure safely, you have to compost it so that you're getting rid of all the bad bacteria. Any animal manure usually has that rule. So these are all, I guess, different considerations about how the product can be used beyond just the nutrition. There's also no nitrates in our fertilizer, so there's no runoff risk that you have with other manures. Compared to black soldier fly, so their frass product is usually mixed with a lot of uneaten food, and so that organic profile is what's called a hot compost, because there's a lot of carbon in the product. And that can actually start to ferment in the field and literally burn a crop because it gets too hot. So there's a lot of considerations when you think about some of these natural organic fertilizer products. And trying to position that and tell that story to farmers is a big part of what we do.
And I've tried it. It works really well.
There's another question here. Yep.
How do you compare to your competitors, and how do you stand apart from them?
Yeah, I've got a few slides here. I can talk about. This is always a question that comes up in discussions with investors. So this is just like a kind of comparison matrix of other ingredients. So BetaHatch, you've got 3 insect producers. Aspire is a company that focuses on food production. They're in Texas. They grow crickets. Antera is a Canadian company that grows black soldier fly. And EnviroFlight is an American company that grows black soldier fly. And then there's other alternative proteins being developed. So single-celled systems. We've got largely fermentation type systems, and then algae is another one, and then plant proteins like soy and fish meal. So this kind of just shows you across each of these different features and traits how BetaHatch is different. So one of the things that, in comparison to single cell and algal systems, is pretty cool about insects is we can separate the breeding and the growing. So unlike those systems where everything's in the same vat, we can actually separate these out, which means we can feed a lower quality feedstock to the ones that are just growing, because we don't need to worry about them becoming adults, reproducing. We just need them to grow quickly. So that's an opportunity there. Separating the breeding and growing, that's something that happens with pretty much all plant production and animal production, but our competitors are doing it all sort of in one location. Seasonality, this is one of the big values of all these alternatives that are being developed. It's not as seasonal as the existing products, the soy and the fish meal that people use. But price is probably the biggest barrier right now. We can't compete on price until we start getting a lot of those operating efficiencies and supply chain efficiencies. And then cost of facilities and equipment to get going. This is something that we've really seen as a barrier to scale, and one of the reasons that we're developing the business model that we have is that we know that, you know, if it's going to take hundreds of millions of dollars to build a bug factory, that's just going to be a big, expensive way to grow. If we can, for $1 million, build a facility, get that going, and turn a profit fast, we can build thousands of those faster than some of the competition can. And then I think one of the biggest features is stability and predictability of production. Climate change equals unpredictability, and we're going to see increasingly value placed on stability in the food system. So much so that we have pretty regular conversations with insurance companies about how our product could help lower the insurance costs for farmers because they don't have as much risk when they've got something that's more stable. Yeah. And then within bug production, you know, there's actually other markets where insects are being produced. So there are companies like Chesapeake Pearl is an example of a company that grows vaccines inside of insects instead of eggs. So anyone who has an egg allergy can't typically have a vaccine, but we can actually grow them in the biomass of an insect using some genomic modifications. Biocontrol, so companies like Copert, Oxytex, a company that grows a transgenic mosquito, sterile insect technique, where you grow a bunch of usually male insects, sterilize them with nuclear radiation, and then release them. And then they'll outcompete the wild males and prevent reproduction. That's a technique that's widely used around the world. And that's actually the Mediterranean fruit fly technology that this one company I mentioned is using is derived from a sterile insect technique production facility. But within the animal feed market, you know, there's a couple other players, largely in Europe. There's been a lot of development. And our individual ranch is smaller than what everyone else is doing, but our combined network, we think, can more quickly get to scale. So that's just sort of some examples of how we think about competitors.
Yeah, those were the ones I expected to see, so AgroProtein and Y-Insect.
Yep.
And Terra. But Terra's doing a different species. Y-Insect is doing the mealworm.
Insect's doing the same species. They're the only one on the slide also doing the mealworm. And they have a mega factory approach. So they're in France. Labor is very expensive. They've put a lot into robotics and automation, and I think that's the right solution for their geography, but it's very expensive. So their next facility, they raised over $100 million to build it. It's going to take 18 months to permit and probably 15 months to build. We're probably going to be able to permit in about 4 weeks, our project, and we're trying to build it out in about 4 months. So just very different strategies for how we're scaling. Yeah.
Okay, guys. Well, since this is a class, but also an open seminar for others, I think we should probably stop here for now. But if anybody has questions, feel free to come up and talk to her afterwards. And otherwise, let's just say thank you.